I'll say a little bit about housekeeping, how we will conduct this session. I will introduce each speaker, and then they will, each speaker, they will give their paper. Then I will introduce the next speaker and the next speaker. We have then a break, and we have a fourth speaker, and then we will open it up immediately to questions and answers from the audience. But first we will hear all of the papers. And with that, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce this session with three dear friends. The first speaker will be Giovanni Coco. Many of you know Giovanni, have heard about Dr. Giovanni Coco. He is an archivist at the Vatican Apostolic Archive and one of the most important scholars, I would say, in this new research, and has just published the book many of you have heard about. It's part of a Vatican Apostolic Archive series to talk about the personal and private papers of Eugenio Pacelli. So we're very eager to see and hear from Dr. Coco, who has a real bird's eye view on this material and has worked with it for years. Thank you.
Una sola volta e mai più. Solo una volta Pio XII si riferì in pubblico alla Shoah usando il concetto di sterminio. Nel 1943, quando parlò di costrizioni sterminatrici, una locuzione contorta, ma sicuramente evocativa. Tuttavia, né prima né dopo, egli avrebbe mai usato quella parola. Un silenzio nel quale fu seguito dai suoi successori, perché nei suoi discorsi pubblici Giovanni XXIII non userà mai la parola sterminio, né tantomeno Paolo VI, che si riferirà alla Shoah usando le parole di tragedia o orribili vessazioni. Bisognerà attendere Giovanni Paolo II nel 1979 ad Auschwitz per sentire di nuovo la parola sterminio pronunciata da un romano pontefice. Solo con queste contraddizioni si può capire quanto siano profonde le ragioni dei cosiddetti silenzi di Pio XII e che molte ne siano le cause, molto più complesse di certe semplificazioni, come bene aveva intuito Giovanni Miccoli, che parlava al plurale di più silenzi e più dilemmi del Papa. D'altra parte, i silenzi cominciarono già dopo la guerra. Il 5 settembre 1939 il Papa rifiutava il consenso a pubblicare le sue parole di solidarietà alla Polonia invasa e per tutta la durata del conflitto egli non avrebbe mai accennato al martirio del clero cattolico nei campi di concentramento. È pur vero che nella tradizione diplomatica vaticana il concetto del silenzio, il principio del silenzio era ben radicato ed era funzionale a mantenere la perfetta imparzialità della Santa Sede. Tuttavia questo principio non fu sempre applicato allo stesso modo. Per la cattolica Polonia Pio XII avrebbe parlato nel 1939, nel 1943 e nel 1944 e alla fine della guerra egli avrebbe rivendicato il martirio del clero cattolico. Tutto ciò non accadde per la Shoah. Non solo, vi era stato un precedente. Nel 1915 Benedetto XV aveva reso pubbliche le sue parole di protesta per le persecuzioni sofferte dal popolo armeno. Tutto questo non accadde per la Shoah ed è in contrasto con le stesse parole usate da Pio XII nella sua prima enciclica, la Summi Pontificatus, del 1939, quando parlava dell'attesa di molti nobili spiriti da noi lontani, i quali, nella loro fame e sete di giustizia, volgono gli occhi alla sede di Pietro e ne aspettano guida e consiglio. E aggiungeva che essi riconoscono nella Chiesa cattolica quella saldezza mostrata quando, a prezzo di tormenti o di martirio, ha da pronunciare «non è lecito». Frasi impegnative che furono salutate con entusiasmo dalla comunità ebraica come la promessa di un aiuto. Quello era il primo di una serie di equivoci. Quelle frasi avevano un altro significato. Prima della dichiarazione conciliare Nostra Aetate del 1965, l'orizzonte diplomatico della Santa Sede non oltrepassava la giurisdizione sui cattolici e raramente sugli altri cristiani. D'altronde era l'unica giurisdizione riconosciuta dagli Stati. È pur vero che anche i non cristiani, compreso gli ebrei, potevano beneficiare di un intervento pontificio, ma in maniera eccezionale, di richiesta diretta e in maniera circoscritta e soprattutto in ambito caritativo e assistenziale. Era quello che Pio XI aveva definito una volta, quel dire o fare qualcosa secondo la buona tradizione della Santa Sede. Un limite angusto e burocratizzato che non poteva essere compreso dai non cristiani, che nutrivano altre aspettative dalla Santa Sede. Ma prima di proseguire oltre, sarà meglio restituire la parola ai documenti, finalmente adesso disponibili, e vedere cosa ci dicono sull'uso di due parole chiave, come sterminio e antisemitismo. Nel 1946, rivolgendosi a una delegazione del Supremo Comitato Arabo della Palestina, Pio XII affermava di aver condannato più volte nel passato le persecuzioni di un antisemitismo fanatico scatenatesi contro il popolo ebraico. Un'affermazione particolarmente rilevante, perché quella era in realtà la prima volta che Pacelli usava in pubblico la parola antisemitismo e lo condannava apertamente. Dietro questa contraddizione c'è un'altra realtà. Prima del Concilio Vaticano II, l'antisemitismo era considerato dalla Chiesa Cattolica un appendice del nazismo e non una minaccia autonoma. E l'unico che aveva intuito questa realtà era stato Pio XI, ma solo in fin di vita. Al contrario, la massima condanna dell'antisemitismo era ritenuta l'enciclica Mitbrennender Sorge del 1937, alla quale Pacelli aveva largamente collaborato. Tuttavia, in quell'enciclica la condanna dell'antisemitismo non era esplicita, ma implicita nella condanna della dottrina della razza e del sangue. Non a caso, per tutta la durata del Terzo Reich, Pacelli evitò di usare la parola razza, preferendo stirpe, stirps, un vocabolo biblico. In altre parole, l'antisemitismo era rigettato per la sua componente paganeggiante e anticristiana, più che per la minaccia al popolo ebraico. Ne è prova la censura della rivista fascista La difesa della razza, della quale si condannavano 10 proposizioni, 9 anticristiane e solo una chiaramente antisemita. Era una percezione distorta del problema che impedì una revisione critica e autocritica di quel bagaglio lasciato dall'antigiudaismo religioso, largamente ancora diffuso, e nel quale si annidavano sacche di antisemitismo, mascherate di moderazione, come nel caso di Monsignor Angelo Dell'Acqua. Una visione miope che non poteva affrontare le sfide aperte dalla guerra. Già dal 1939 si conoscono le sofferenze del popolo polacco e dal 1940 le persecuzioni sistematiche di quello ebraico. Notizie ritenute sostanzialmente credibili, ma in ossequio alla prassi tradizionale la Santa Sede si occupa prevalentemente del suo gregge, i cattolici polacchi. La questione ebraica viene relegata in un angolo, tutt'al più a livello caritativo assistenziale. In questo senso, però, Pio XII segue la linea dei suoi maestri. Per affrontare la questione ebraica, anzi per affrontare quella polacca prima di tutto, egli sceglie la via del silenzio, la via appresa da uno dei suoi maestri, il cardinale Mariano Rampolla del Tindaro, segretario di Stato di Leone XIII, che nel 1912 sosteneva: in una fase violenta di persecuzione, la tradizione della Santa Sede è di salvare i principi, senza prendere provvedimenti non necessari, i quali potrebbero dar pretesto al persecutore per infierire maggiormente. Parole che riecheggiano nel discorso fatto da Pio XII all'ambasciatore italiano Dino Alfieri nel 1940. Noi dovremmo dire parole di fuoco contro simili cose e solo ci trattiene dal farlo sapere che renderemmo la condizione di quegli infelici, se parlassimo, ancora più dura. Nel 1941 una nuova parola entra nel lessico vaticano, è sterminio. Ad usarla per la prima volta è l'ambasciatore di Polonia, Kazimierz Papé, che invia una lunga nota diplomatica dal titolo «L'occupazione sterminatrice della Polonia». La parola sterminio appare dirompente in Vaticano, perché appare come un passo troppo lungo per una diplomazia che ancora cerca la composizione immediata del conflitto. Anche in questo caso Pio XII fa sua la lezione appresa da un altro maestro, il cardinale Merry del Val, segretario di Stato di Pio X, che sosteneva che in simili circostanze, per un giudizio pubblico del Papa, occorrerebbe premettere un'inchiesta regolare. La sua autorità non può essere esposta. Non è un caso che, per rispondere all'ambasciatore Papé, l'aggettivo sterminatrice viene cancellato dalle parole occupazione della Polonia. Tuttavia Pio XII cominciava ad avvertire il peso di questa scelta diplomatica del silenzio e nel 1941 chiedeva a Monsignor Roncalli se il suo silenzio circa il contegno sul nazismo non è giudicato male. Si moltiplicavano le notizie sulla persecuzione antiebraica e nel settembre 1942, mentre Monsignor Dell'Acqua continua a sminuire le notizie sulla Shoah, perché lui sostiene tra gli ebrei è facile l'esagerazione, Monsignor Giovanni Battista Montini per primo nella segreteria di Stato usa la frase «lo sterminio che si sta facendo degli ebrei» in un documento interno della segreteria di Stato. Si noti che la parola sterminio viene associata agli ebrei e non ai polacchi che l'avevano usata per la prima volta. Ciononostante ancora prevaleva il timore per le conseguenze di una parola pubblica. Scriveva Monsignor Domenico Tardini: il governo tedesco, sentendosi colpito, inasprirebbe ancora la persecuzione contro il cattolicesimo in Polonia. Ma le ripetute voci sulla Shoah, confermate anche da dentro il mondo tedesco, come nel caso della lettera del gesuita Lothar König, spinsero Pio XII a prendere una posizione. Nel radiomessaggio natalizio del 1942, Papa Pacelli aggiunse volutamente alcune parole sulle centinaia di migliaia di persone che per ragione di nazionalità o di stirpe sono destinate alla morte o ad un progressivo deperimento. Una frase timida, allusiva, in cui si parlava ancora vagamente di morte o deperimento. Con la parola stirpe invece egli alludeva proprio al popolo ebraico, come scrisse in una lettera a Monsignor Preising, vescovo di Berlino. Non si usava ancora la parola sterminio, ma da lì a poco Pio XII avrebbe superato il limite che si era prefisso. Nel suo discorso al Sacro Collegio del 2 giugno 1943, dopo aver evocato il martirio del popolo polacco, Pio XII aggiunse un passaggio sugli ebrei: coloro che per ragione della loro nazionalità o della loro stirpe sono destinati talora, anche senza propria colpa, a costrizioni sterminatrici. Questa volta si usava quell'aggettivo, sterminatrice, che tanta reticenza aveva suscitato in precedenza. Non solo. Pio XII ordinò che il suo discorso, pubblicato sull'Osservatore Romano, avesse una rubrica esplicativa: sofferenze di popoli per ragione di nazionalità o di stirpe. Quelle frasi avrebbero rappresentato la punta massima della protesta pubblica sulla Shoah di Pio XII. L'allusione era diventata stringente e la stampa italiana, in ossequio al regime fascista, tacque su questo passaggio. Si era arrivati forse alla vigilia di una svolta? C'è da dubitarne. Il Papa avvertiva in maniera forte la pressione al silenzio che proveniva dal mondo cattolico tedesco e in favore del mondo cattolico tedesco. Non solo, gli eventi presero il sopravvento. Dopo l'occupazione di Roma, la vicenda dei silenzi conosce nuovi capitoli e l'atteggiamento della Santa Sede appare sicuramente reticente davanti alla tragica giornata del 16 ottobre 1943, il rastrellamento del ghetto. Spesso si è cercato qualche documento per chiarire in qualche modo la mente della Santa Sede. Forse una lettera del cardinale Schuster del 14 novembre, quasi un mese dopo, aiuta a chiarire qualcosa. Il cardinale Schuster di Milano chiedeva che i vescovi lombardi fossero autorizzati a protestare contro le razzie anti-ebraiche in Italia settentrionale. Monsignor Dell'Acqua scriveva il 16 novembre: a me sembra che non convenga che la Santa Sede si interessi direttamente della questione. Non lo fece, almeno mi pare, per la Germania, per la Francia, per l'Olanda, per la Slovacchia, eccetera. Non vedo perché debba ora scostarsi da tale linea di condotta. E aggiungeva: sembra piuttosto consigliabile un'azione confidenziale, tanto più che principi generali sono stati più volte chiaramente esposti dalla Santa Sede. L'esperienza ha dimostrato che pubbliche dichiarazioni non fanno che maggiormente irritare le autorità e danneggiare quindi coloro cui si desidera e si vuole far del bene. In quelle frasi si riassumevano tutte le paure, i preconcetti e i limiti dell'azione svolta dalla Santa Sede sulla questione ebraica. Non ultima la paura per le vittime. A torto o a ragione, il silenzio era considerato in Vaticano una questione di necessità fino all'autocensura. Il 23 ottobre, 7 giorni dopo il rastrellamento, soldati tedeschi diffondono a Roma la voce che il Papa sarebbe stato d'accordo sulla deportazione, una menzogna destituita da ogni fondamento. Stupisce la reazione del Papa. Viene preparata una nota di protesta, però all'ultimo momento vengono cancellate le parole di protesta. Saranno riferite semmai a voce. Nemmeno la calunnia smuove dal silenzio. Tuttavia, anche in questo clima così pesante, Pio XII ebbe un sussulto. Nella grande udienza pubblica del 12 marzo 1944 egli usò la parola deportati, che nella Roma dell'epoca era una citazione temeraria, ma quella parola si perse nel profluvio del discorso. Seguì la triste giornata tragica delle Fosse Ardeatine con la reazione risentita, è giusto dirlo, della comunità cattolica romana. E Gilberto Martire, cattolico e fascista, scriveva a tal proposito: contro simili orrori il vescovo di Roma ha taciuto. La nostra coscienza di cattolici e di romani sanguina per l'offesa e la delusione di questo silenzio, che non è il solo. Roma, è vero, è stata salvata dal suo vescovo, nessuno potrà mai dimenticarlo, ma noi volevamo pure la parola. La ragione diplomatica della neutralità non ci appaga. La liberazione di Roma non cambiò questo quadro. Dal 44 al 45 si susseguono appelli da comitati ebraici, dagli alleati per un intervento della Santa Sede. La diplomazia vaticana compie dei passi, più o meno grandi, con risultati più o meno efficaci. Tuttavia, quando l'Osservatore Romano vuole pubblicare la notizia degli assassini di massa che si compiono nei campi di concentramento ad opera dei tedeschi, la risposta della Segreteria di Stato è di nuovo negativa. In altre parole, la macchina vaticana faticava a comprendere la sfida davanti la quale la poneva la storia. Bisognerà attendere il 2 marzo 1945 perché la parola sterminio compaia in un documento vaticano in uscita, uncifrato a Monsignor Orsenigo, nunzio a Berlino. A guerra conclusa, la progressiva comprensione dei limiti avuti nella gestione della questione ebraica crea domande imbarazzanti. E così dice Monsignor Tardini, che scrive: se la Santa Sede nel 1942 sapeva tutte queste cose, perché non ha gridato dinanzi al mondo? Un disagio tradito dallo stesso Pio XII, che nel suo discorso al Sacro Collegio del 2 giugno 1945 rivendica l'azione svolta e sostiene con enfasi che nessuno potrebbe accusare la Chiesa di non aver denunziato a tempo il vero carattere del nazionalsocialismo. A queste parole rispondeva a distanza un anno dopo il cardinale Raffaello Rossi, che discutendo dell'eventualità della condanna del comunismo diceva: se forse avessimo condannato a tempo il nazismo non ci troveremmo oggi nella situazione in cui siamo. ma mentre iniziava questo processo di revisione si ponevano le basi per la sua precoce fine. La nascita dello Stato di Israele, l'emigrazione ebraica in Palestina, la tutela dei luoghi santi, della minoranza cattolica e cristiana palestinese pongono di nuovo la Santa Sede davanti a scelte e inizia a chiudersi a riccio. In questo clima, qualsiasi parola che evochi lo sterminio, che sia di riconoscimento di quanto è avvenuto, poteva essere vista come un endorsement nei confronti di Israele e quindi rifiutata. Per questo motivo, il 29 novembre 1945, quando ebrei reduci dai campi di concentramento vanno in udienza da Pio XII per ringraziarlo, il Papa li accoglie amabilmente, ma non usa mai la parola sterminio. E l'anno dopo, quando l'ambasciatore e filosofo francese Jacques Maritain chiede un passo energico della Santa Sede sull'antisemitismo, abbiamo la risposta negativa di Pio XII e Monsignor Montini aggiunge: non è possibile, qua e là vi sono ebrei che stanno vendicandosi e commettono azioni riprorevoli. D'altra parte, anche dopo la guerra, nella curia romana rimaneva diffuso il pregiudizio antigiudaico. In una lettera a Monsignor Montini, il domenicano Mariano Cordovani, insigne teologo, definiva il popolo ebraico come disperso e punito da una sanzione divina per un tradimento incancellabile. Parole che stupiscono se si pensa che Cordovani non era né razzista né antisemita, ma sono la fotografia di un mondo sul quale gravava ancora e aleggiava l'accusa del deicidio. Esistevano lodevoli eccezioni, come nel caso del gesuita Augustin Bea, confessore personale di Pio XII, che spinse il Papa al superamento dell'antigiudaismo, ma non fu un processo semplice né lineare, ne prova la vicenda della eventuale modifica della preghiera del Venerdì Santo pro Perfidis Iudeis, che vide a lungo Pio XII oscillare, fino poi a mantenere lo status quo, con una piccola rubrica esplicativa che non era per niente incisiva. Questa chiusura progressiva divenne poi un arroccamento in posizioni acriticamente difensive. Nel 1954, con l'uscita del libro di Leon Poliakov, Il nazionalsocialismo e lo sterminio degli ebrei, l'Osservatore romano risponde con un articolo di Federico Alessandrini, articolo rivisto dalla Segreteria di Stato. Veniva inaugurata quella linea di difesa sostanzialmente voluta dallo stesso Pio XII, che poi avrebbe trovato sviluppo negli Actes et Documents en Siège e che avrebbe dominato a lungo certa storiografia. Ma sarebbe errato credere che la Shoah sia passata senza incidere sul magistero cattolico. Nel discorso tenuto ai giuristi nel 1953, Pio XII dirà che in queste ultime decine di anni si è assistito a massacri per odio di razza, si sono manifestati davanti al mondo intero gli orrori e le crudeltà dei campi di concentramento. Sebbene non usi la parola sterminio, divenuta politicamente pericolosa, il Papa tornava indietro nel tempo e con la scelta della parola massacri alludeva all'Olocausto e lo condannava. Non è un caso che questo discorso sia citato nella Dichiarazione conciliare Dignitatis Humanae del 1965 sui diritti umani. Nonostante questi progressi appaiano lenti, la questione ebraica aveva lasciato una traccia, anche a livello psicologico più profondo. Nel 1957, nel suo discorso ai delegati dell'American Jewish Committee, Papa Pacerli parlò nuovamente delle persecuzioni per motivi di razza e di quelle antisemite, definite come una violazione dei diritti fondamentali inerenti alla vita umana. Ma questa volta egli definì la posizione della Chiesa verso i popoli perseguitati come interesse, non dovere, e cancellò la frase dove c'era scritto dovere. Segno di un prudente ripensamento rispetto a un certo linguaggio magniloquente usato nel 1939, nella prima enciclica, che aveva suscitato tanti entusiasmi poi delusi. Questa volta c'era la consapevolezza di usare promesse con parole più consone alle intenzioni concrete. Segno di una coscienza, quella di Pio XII, che ormai un anno prima della morte era ancora mosso da una sana inquietudine per una ferita mai rimarginata, un sentimento purtroppo rimasto per molti anni elitario nella curia romana. Vi ringrazio per l'attenzione.
It's my pleasure to now introduce David Kertzer. David Kertzer is research professor at Brown University in the United States, where from 2006 to 2011 he served as provost. His book, The Pope and Mussolini, was awarded the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for Biography and has been published in 11 languages. Among his many other books, The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara was a finalist for the 1997 National Book Award for nonfiction and has been published in 18 foreign editions. He co-founded and served for many years as co-editor of the Journal of Modern Italian Studies. In 2005, he was elected to membership in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His 2022 book, The Pope at War, based on research in at the Vatican Archives, but also Italian, German, French, British, and American archives, tells the story of Pope Pius XII's relations with Mussolini and Hitler during the Second World War, and editions have appeared in the USA, Italy, Germany, and Britain.
Prima di tutto, grazie agli organizzatori per questo convegno importante. But I will speak in English.
I guess the Italian translation's not working right now. Are we?
Posso fare tutte e due. O eccessivo.
That's okay. Okay, we're good now.
Okay, thank you. In examining how Pope Pius XII dealt with the deportation of Italy's Jews to their death, a good deal of attention has focused over his silence on October. Great attention, of course, is understandably focused on October 16th, 1943, and the silence of the Pope as the over 1,000 Jews of Rome were being deported to their death at Auschwitz. But less attention has been paid to the order that came 6 weeks later from the rump Italian state itself in the form of Mussolini's Italian Social Republic. The order came November 30th from Guido Buffarini Guidi, the Minister of Interior Affairs. The order went to all the prefects and police departments of Italy, ordering that all Jews in Italy be arrested, all their property seized, and they all be sent to concentration camps. In this brief presentation, I would like to touch on some of the issues involved in understanding the Pope's reaction to this order and to the nationwide hunting down of Italy's Jews. Following the early September 1943 occupation of most of mainland Italy by the German troops, and at the same time their liberation of Mussolini from his imprisonment, Mussolini's Italian Social Republic was established. In mid-November, an assembly of fascist representatives met in Verona and produced a program for the puppet regime. Point 6 of the new neo-fascist government's program read, "The religion of the Republic is that of the Roman Catholic Church." The following point added, quote, "Members of the Jewish race are foreigners. During the war, they belong to the enemy nation," unquote. 2 weeks later, so it was 2 weeks later after this Verona document that on November 30th, Guidi Buffarini Guidi issued the order I just referred to arrest all Jews in Italy and send them to concentration camps. However, he added an important caveat to that order to the prefects of Italy. quote, Jews born of mixed marriages should be considered Aryan, unquote. As I detailed in my recent book, this proviso came in the wake of years of Vatican pressure on Buffarini. Buffarini, from the beginning of the racial laws in 1938 until early 1943, as the Undersecretary of the Interior, was basically in charge of the racial laws. He oversaw them. And throughout those 5 years, the Vatican worked furiously to convince him to spare Jewish converts to Catholicism, and those Jews who had married Catholics in church ceremonies sanctioned on the basis that they promised to have all their children baptized at birth. This Vatican concern for baptized Jews continued to be manifest as the roundup of Jews during the German occupation got underway. As the only pole of authority in most of Italy outside of the neo-fascist government and its German sponsors, Pius XII was seen by many, Jews included, as their only hope. A week after the new roundup order was issued, for example, taking something from these newly opened archives, the Pope received one such plea. She says, and here I quote, "I am an Italian Jew. Turning to you, I feel I interpret the ardent desire of all my co-religionists. All is concluding in the tragic manner you know. We must allow ourselves to be arrested, sent to concentration camps, have all our property seized. Direct reaction, impossible. Advice, which I define as divine, has prompted me to turn to you, sole oasis in the world where help can be asked. Prevent yet new sorrows from falling on our families that are already so distressed. Publicly protest these proceedings." This and other such requests from Italy's Jews were to go unrequited. As the German ambassador to the Holy See, Ambassador Weizsäcker, reported from the Vatican to Berlin 2 weeks after the new roundup of the country's Jews was ordered, quote, "As for any protest by the Pope for the arrest of the Jews, there is not even any discussion." As I discussed in my recent book, The Pope at War, in mid-December, in the wake of this new order to arrest all of Italy's Jews, the long-time, though unofficial papal link or tramite to the Italian fascist government, Pietro Tacchi-Venturi, sent a plea to the Vatican Secretary of State, and he asked that an unofficial protest be lodged with the German ambassador to the Holy See. His argument was that Italy's racial laws, and here I quote from his letter, the racial laws in Italy, quote, rigorously observed, already took care of the indisputable difficulties caused by Judaism when it comes to dominate or to enjoy much reputation in a nation, unquote. Secretary of State Cardinal Maglione sent the memo to the man the Pope and he regarded as their great expert on Jewish matters throughout the war years, the Monsignor Angelo Dell'Acqua. Later on, he would go on to become Sostituto and then later Cardinal Vicar of Rome. We already heard him mentioned by Dr. Coco. He asked should he go ahead with some kind of protest along the lines that had been suggested by his Jesuit emissary to the fascist government. A month earlier, Dell'Acqua had been called upon to advise the Pope on how to respond to a plea from the Bishop of Trieste in the wake of the German occupation of that city and the beginning of its roundup of the city's large Jewish population. Dell'Acqua responded, quote, "I do not share the thought of Monsignor Bishop of Trieste that the current situation in Venezia Giulia favors such an official intervention by the Holy See in favor of the Jews, an official intervention by the Holy See, he wrote, might confirm the Nazi leaders in the false idea, that is, that the Holy See is in agreement with international Jewry, which preaches the necessity of the destruction or virtual destruction of the German people, unquote, is the advice the Pope was getting from his trusted advisor on Jewish matters. As it happened, the day before Taki Venturi wrote his memo calling for a protest, albeit not a public one, Dell'Acqua had written a memo for Monsignor Montini, who was one of the two, might say, division heads under the Cardinal Secretary of State, the Sostituto, and future Pope Paul VI. And this was in response to a plea received on behalf of a woman who had recently been seized. So this is the advice given by Monsignor Dell'Acqua. In all likelihood, Signora Amalia Fleischer, a non-Aryan Catholic, he referred to Jews as non-Aryans, was sent to a concentration camp following the well-known provisions adopted by the Republican government. Thus, an official and direct intervention by the Holy See does not seem opportune to me. It is a rather delicate matter. One might, on the other hand, signal the case in a reserved and confidential way to Marshal Graziani, who was Minister of War of the Republican government, the fascist government. Perhaps one might at least be able to obtain not having Signora Fleischer transferred to Germany. If instead, the order to send her to a concentration camp came from the German authorities, then one might send a note to the German embassy without, however, obtaining anything, as experience demonstrates that when one is dealing with non-Aryans. That is, they recognize that appeals to the Germans on behalf of Jews who had been seized would not be responded to by the German authorities. Now, in his response to Taki Venturi's mid-December memo calling for some kind of protest about the roundup of Italy's Jews, Monsignor Dell'Acqua argued strongly against lodging any kind of official protest to this new order. One must, he wrote, recognize the destructive influence the Jews have had. And he pointed out that for centuries, popes had adopted measures, quote, to limit the Jews' influence, unquote. Again, he suggested that at most, perhaps someone could speak with Marshal Graziani and suggest the Jews be treated less harshly. Graziani, by the way, as many of you know, Minister of War in the Republican government, was one of the major war criminals dealt with after the war, and it's actually interesting stories there about Vatican relations with Graziani after the war, but that's for another day. So in short, Dell'Acqua called on the Secretary of State and the Pope not to voice any protest to the German ambassador about the roundup of Italy's Jews. What did continue, however, were vigorous Vatican efforts on behalf of baptized Jews, whom the Vatican officials kept insisting should be treated as Catholics and exempt from the measures aimed at Jews. Remarkably, the same Italian so-called race and demography office, La Demorazza, that had been instituted in 1938 as part of the organization of the anti-Semitic racial laws, it continued to function in a way even after the German occupation. The Vatican Secretary of State, largely through the Jesuit Father Taki Venturi, had pleaded to that office on behalf of hundreds of converted Jews over the previous 5 years. On December 17, 1943, the Archbishop of Ferrara wrote to Monsignor Montini on behalf of a woman in his diocese. Lina Rava had one Jewish parent, but 3 of her grandparents were Catholic, and she herself had been baptized at birth. One does not understand, wrote the Archbishop in mid-December 1943, in the middle of the German occupation, one does not understand, the bishop wrote, why the government has applied its anti-Jewish measures to her. As in many other such cases, the Archdiocese had certified her Catholic credentials to the government authorities by sending in copies of baptismal certificates to prove that she should be let go. Now, the Archbishop asked for help from the Holy See in the name, he wrote, of the person who is living through hours of agony. As he had in hundreds of such cases over the previous years, in this case too, Secretary of State Cardinal Maglione sent the plea to Father Tacchi Venturi for action. On December 28th, the Jesuit replied, and here I quote him, "I immediately this morning discussed the case with the excellent Lavia, Director General of the Demography and Race Office." The problem, Tacchi Venturi reported, was that in moving the government following the overthrow, the initial overthrow of Mussolini and then the reestablishment of the new neo-fascist government, in moving the government to the north, it had moved the archives of the Race and Demography Division to the north as well. So they were unable to determine whether all of the baptismal credentials of this woman would be sufficient to have her categorized as of the Aryan race rather than the Jewish race. Throughout these months, the Vatican regularly refused pleas by those subject to deportation to be granted refuge in Vatican City, and avoided as well taking any direct role in finding refuge for Jews in the city's religious institutions. A typical case is offered by the December 30th, 1943, to the Pope by Costanza Sed, a woman who described herself as, quote, an Israelite mother living in terror for the fate of her only son, barely 20 years old, unquote. Her many efforts to find safety for him, she recounted, had proven vain. So she writes to the Pope, "In this anguished struggle, only one great hope sustains her, the hope that you, most blessed Father, will not fail to give your powerful aid. She begs you that you permit her son to find refuge and safety even in the smallest and most miserable corner of Vatican City, or in another place dependent in some way on the Holy See," unquote. On January 7th, 1944, Dell'Acqua offered his advice on how to reply, how the Pope should reply, advice which was in fact followed. His advice was the following, quote, "It seems opportune to me to invite the parish priest of Signora Sed to come to the Secretariat of State. There one can charge him with making Signora Sed, with all possible kindness, understand how it is not possible to grant her desire. The parish priest can also add how much the Holy See has done and continues to do in favor of the non-Aryans," unquote. While many Jews and baptized Jews did find shelter for shorter or long periods in Rome's church institutions, finding such a place was far from easy, even for those who had been baptized. A case in point is offered by Gerda Pollack, who wrote to Pius XII in late November 1943, telling him that in her desperate situation, quote, "There remains for me no other hope than to turn to your holiness," unquote. A Viennese immigrant to Rome, she explained, she was considered of mixed race. Her mother, Aryan Protestant, as she put it, her father also Protestant, but of Jewish blood, as she put it. She was baptized Protestant at birth, but in Rome in 1942, converted to Roman Catholicism. She had gone into hiding when the Germans occupied Rome in September 1943, initially with friends, but then, having nowhere to go, desperately sought a convent that would take her in. A January 1944 memo by Monsignor Di Meglio, who was one of the key members of the staff of the Vatican Secretary of State office, he describes their response to Pollack's plea to the Pope. Somewhat long, but I think a revealing passage. This is by Monsignor Di Meglio, one of the major staff members at the Secretariat of State. The undersigned called on Father Giuseppe Schiffers, assistant parish priest of San Giuseppe in Via Nomentana, which is Rome, to take an interest in the matter, however, in a purely personal and private way, not in the name of the Vatican. All of the Reverend Mother Superior, interrogated by the above-mentioned father, that is, asking if they would shelter this baptized woman, all of them, he says, responded negatively. The undersigned then personally initiated a round of various religious houses. These too responded negatively, because in the meantime of the noted facts of the Lombard College, of the Franciscan Institute that hosted General Caracciolo, etc., I'll get to that in a minute, with the relative warnings in the press. Naturally, the undersigned believed it possible only to offer a humble prayer, abstaining from any insistence to avoid having the Holy See, even if only indirected, and this is in dealing with the convents, even if only indirectly represented as having any responsibility in the matter. A few days ago, however, he reports, the Signorina was taken in, finally, thanks to the charitable solicitation of Signorina Paolucci in the Institute of the Sisters of Zion, unquote. Di Meglio's mention to the events of the Lombard College and the general who was seized had to do with a series of raids that the Italian fascists, backed by the Germans, made on some church institutions in Rome, and where they seized various people hiding out there. Of course, most of the people hiding out were not Jews. They were everyone from generals, former members of the fascist government who didn't go along with Mussolini when he went north, people who were fleeing forced labor, people, soldiers from the demobilized Italian army who didn't want to be mobilized into the new fascist military. In the short time I've had for this presentation, I could only offer a handful of cases from the newly opened Vatican archives to illustrate the larger dynamic of the Vatican reaction to the deportation of Italy's Jews. The Pope's action in the months that are the focus of this brief paper can only be understood, however, in the context of his desire through these months of German occupation to maintain amicable relations with the German military authorities. This, of course, was not because he approved of the ongoing German efforts to murder Italy's Jews, which, needless to say, he personally deplored. For a discussion, however, of the reasons for his silence and his actions at the time, I would refer those interested to my book, Un Papa in Guerra, The Pope at War. Thank you.
I'm going to introduce Nina Valbousquet, and she will give her paper, and then we will take a 15-minute break, and we will, after that, hear the final paper of the panel and go to questions. Dr. Nina Valbousquet is co-organizer of the École française de Rome 5-year research program and yearly seminar on the Pius XII archives. She's been a research fellow at the École from 2019 to 2023 and working in the Vatican archives. During her tenure, she has been the scientific curator of the exhibition The Churches and the Holocaust at the Shoah Memorial in Paris and editor of the catalog.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to the conference and for putting this conference together. It is very nice to see so many familiar faces and colleagues from the archives here. but my thoughts and sympathy go specifically to our colleagues from Yad Vashem, who cannot be here today. So I would like to start with the striking words of the Jesuit father, Roger Braun, who was the chaplain in the camps of France. And here you can see a picture of him with the Yad Vashem medal from in 72. So in September 1942, he sent a report to the nuncio in Vichy, Monsignor Valerio Valeri, about the mass roundups of Jews happening during that time in France. Quote, "In all of my visits to Lyon, convents, families, and Vichy as well as Riom, I found secular priests, religious of several orders, nuns, civilians of all denominations and even nationalities, civil servants, astonished and almost scandalized to see the hierarchy and even Rome remain silent, with the exception of the bishops of Toulouse and Montauban." So Braun highlights the exceptional nature of the protest from the bishops in France in the face of the roundups, mostly referring to Monseigneur Saliège, the first one to break the silence on August 23rd, 1942, followed by Monseigneur Théas, the Bishop of Montauban, the pastoral letter of August 26, read on August 30. We know that they were followed by 3 other letters from Marseille, Albi, and Lyon, of course, so 5 bishop protests in total. What's interesting in the quote by Braun is that he stressed the question of silence in the perspective of Vatican French Church articulation, meaning the articulation between the central, the national, and the local levels. We know that Pius XII was aware and concerned by his own silences. In the face of anti-Jewish persecutions, he did not intervene in the first person, not directly. He left a great deal of autonomy to local bishops and to the diplomacy of the nuncios. The Vatican feared that a defense of persecuted Jews would be seen as a kind of interference, intrusion in internal national politics outside of its jurisdictions, unless these Jews were converted. The Vatican also feared reprisal against the Church, as Pius XII expressed very clearly to the Bishop of Berlin in April 1943. On the question of anti-Jewish persecution, the Pope left local pastors free to take initiatives and assess the situation in order to avoid greater evils. So for matter of time today, I will focus only on the case of the nuncio in Vichy, France, so Monsignor Valerio Valeri. The prior French scholarship often portray Valerio in more positive terms, actively involved in the protest of the bishops in 1942. And the apologetic literature even claimed that the 5 bishop protests in France were encouraged and even initiated by Pius XII himself. In contrast, new revelations from the Pius XII archives present a much more nuanced picture in which the local context is actually more important than the nuncio. Ironically, this is that's something that Monsignor Angelo Dell'Acqua was aware of, and we already mentioned that famous note of October 2nd, 1942, responding to the memorandum, the American memorandum about the Nazi plan of extermination of the Jews. So after Dell'Acqua mentioned the so-called Jewish exaggerations and Allies' instrumentalization of Vatican Declaration, the final paragraph of this report alludes to the French context. It's worth bearing in mind, finally, that the recent protest of the French bishops about the deportation of the Jews a protest which is thought to have been suggested by the Holy See, is sufficient to prove the Catholic Church disapproval of such inhuman acts. The Anglo-Americans did not and do not fail to profit from such a protest. So this raises a methodological point. In the Pius Wars, so the trial against the Pope or the apology for the Pope, the focus is excessively on the Pope himself, as if everything in the Church depended on him and stemmed from his will. So this is what Renato Moro, among others, point out as an excessive generalization from the Pope to the Church at the expense of the sociological complexity of the churches. And it is precisely the richness and diversity of the new archives, the new Vatican archives, that enable historians to go beyond the figure of the Pope alone and to highlight the nuances, the tensions, and the internal debates that play out at several levels, within the Vatican Curia, within the Vatican diplomacy, and then in national and local churches. So the case of Valerio Valeri, which is nuncio in Paris since 1936 and then in Vichy, offers a case in point. Because Valeri was very typical of the Vatican's more general stance on anti-Jewish persecution. Priority was given to the defense of the church prerogatives, a cautious diplomatic reserve, so the defense of Vatican neutrality, the fear of political instrumentalization of any kind of Vatican declaration, strong anti-communism, and in the case of Valeria specifically, the persistence of anti-Jewish prejudices, what Giovanni Miccoli has called the historical memory of the Church. So, like the majority of the Church in France, Valéry welcomed the regime of Maréchal Pétain, praising its, quote, remarkable work of restoration. Concerning the situation of Jews, let me first mention the Brazilian action that some of you know very well, meaning the visas that were granted to the Vatican by Brazil, 3,000 visas, to refugees that were defined non-Aryan Catholics. Unlike his colleagues, the Nuncio Micara in Belgium, Jobe in the Netherlands, and Bernardini in Switzerland, the Nuncio Valeri was initially reluctant toward the Brazilian action, arguing with Maglione, it would be good if Brazil extends its hospitality to German Aryans too. In fact, non-Aryans, even if baptized, generally keep friendships and financial means in the milieu they come from to find a way out. Whereas this is more difficult for refugee Aryans, in our case, Catholics by origin. So this is October 10, 1940, and I would like to mention about Valéry's prejudices against so-called Jewish influence. This letter from October 4, saying that he was concerned about the deposit of the Vatican in the Rothschild Bank in France, and saying that the things itself could be exploité in French, meaning instrumentalized, and adding at the end, it's true that there were very few banks where Jews did not have their hands in one way or another. So this is October 4th, 1940, and the date is significant because this is also the date of the first status of the Jews in France, so the first anti-Semitic laws of Vichy France, which Valéry mostly blamed it on the Jews, saying that they were responsible for the outbreak of the war. And I would like to quote a new and unpublished document from the Vatican Archives, which is a second report he sent after the promulgation of the first Statute of the Jews on October 29. Quote, finally came the legislation of the Jews, a measure which is certainly not cheerful because it does not correspond entirely to Christian principles, but it is taken with certain mitigations which will make it less derogatory and less extreme. In the meantime, the sphere of business for which they seem to be born and scattered across the vast world remains totally open to them. On the other hand, they are excluded on the whole not only from the management of public affairs, but also from central administrations, the army and navy, and from management position in certain companies, the press, the cinema, and so on. On this point, we can only thank the Lord when we think of the evil they were doing with these means. So the only reservation here, Christian principles allude to the condemnation of biological racism, which we have mentioned already before in our discussion. But the nuncio did not call into question the fundamental injustice of a law that excluded Jews from society. So this position, which is deeply ambivalent, was very typical of other diplomats in different countries in front of anti-Jewish legislation in Italy, Hungary, or Romania, for instance, where the only reservations concern converts and mixed marriages, a point that Valéry made more clear after the second statute, saying that it raised a painful issue, particularly for the Catholic Church, which has always considered it its duty to facilitate the conversion of Jews, and which ignores in canon law any distinction between the Aryan and the racial Jew who has become a Christian. So this is a nod to Pétain, and this is the further Valéry who would actually go in his condemnation of the racial law also in France. So coming now to the roundups of Jews in France, Valéry did not mention to Maglione the first roundups in 1941, but it's worth mentioning Alfredo Pacini, who was the advisor of the Nunciature, and who was also responsible in France for Polish refugees, and he was in contact with the Polish government in exile. And already in March 1942, he sent a letter to Maglione about the beginning of the deportations, the mass deportations from Poland of Jews, and so that's the beginning of the Reinhard action. So Pacini wrote directly to Maglione without passing by Valéry. So it's worth noting that also from France, this information were coming to the Vatican. So now mentioning the context of the summer 1942. That's the first time that the Catholic hierarchy in France actually protested against the anti-Semitism of Nazi Germany and the Nazi occupants and of Vichy. The first protest was against the Paris Veldiv roundup of July 1942, but it was still a private protest. The Archbishop of Paris, Cardinal Suard, wrote to Pétain, in the name of humanity and Christian principle, our voice rises in favor of the irrevocable rights of the human person. That private letter was considered by Valéry a rather Platonic protest. The meaning is not very clear, has not been very clear since now, but in a note sent to Maglione on October 8, Valéry said, I do not need to remind you that Cardinal Suard had already sent to the Monsieur le Maréchal a note of respectful protest concerning the measures for the Jews, always Judea for Valéry. The gesture was made discreetly, even if the news also circulated quietly in certain circles in Paris. So the sense of respectful protest actually highlights the Platonic protest, meaning that Valéry aimed at reassuring Maglione that the protest was would not damage church-state good relationship under Vichy France. It's different instead with the roundups in the Free Zone in mid-August 1942, and then the protest of the 5 bishops in France. Actually, no. Move a little bit forward. And especially the protest of Cardinal Gerlier of September 6, because Gerlier was the primat of the Gaule. And you can see here he received some death threat, for instance, for this protest. Funérailles très bientôt, so this is supposed to be a coffin. And then the press in France, the collaborationist press, also accused Gerlier of being philo-Semitic and being manipulated by Jews. Valéry did not mention the protest because he was on leave during August and September, so not in Vichy, and it's instead Pacini who mentioned the protest. on September 5, so on September 5th. And the protests were acknowledged by Baglione at the end of October, so much later, without any comments. Pacini pointed out the risk of instrumentalization of the protest, of the bishop protest, writing to Baglione on September 21st, 1942, a few days ago, in a small town in the south of France, some communists who wanted to organize an anti-government demonstration to which they gave a patriotic character, displayed numerous copies of Monseigneur Salège, so from Toulouse, letter on the walls of the houses that made quite an impression. So here Pacini pointed out the risk of instrumentalization of the protest against Vichy. But soon enough, the bishops actually reassure the Vatican and Vichy France, and you can see that picture is significant because it was taken in November 1942, and both Suard and Gerlier and also Salège actually uttered some speeches saying that they were loyal to Vichy France and that they were denouncing the roundups of Jews as being inhuman, but they were still loyal to Vichy France. And so there was a point that actually the Nuncio Valeri also praised in his correspondence to Baglione. And in October 22, 1942, he stated that the persecution were over and saying there, we also heard that the sending of non-Aryans to Eastern Europe has been suspended. The problem of the agenda is rather that of sending specialized workers to Germany, so forced labor. And I would like to point out that despite the deportations of the summer 1942, the anti-Jewish prejudices of Valeri, of the Nuncio Valeri, persisted. For instance, in that comment of December 17, 1942. Speaking of Jews, it's curious to note, from what I've been told recently, that it's quite rare to see people in Paris with a famous star on their clothes. So either the Jews have disappeared, or they already work out a trick, una combina, to get away with it. So comment that it's not of the most humanist possible. But it's also interesting to notice how Valeri coordinated charity and aid on the ground by approving it, not initiating it, but approving it, but with some recommendations. And I will close on that last example from the archives of Toulouse, actually. It's Monseigneur de Courrèges, who is the auxiliary of Salège, and who mentioned that Jewish children were hiding in a maison d'accueil de Vendine, so next to Toulouse. And Valeri approved of it, but he said, quote, "You have undoubtedly done the right thing in taking in the Jewish children too. We must, however, be careful that their presence does not harm their classmates from a religious point of view." So it's the fear of spiritual contamination. And so prejudices and charity actually were not mutually exclusive, but the two phenomena were combined in the same representative. And so I would like to conclude just quoting the remarkable speech of the French Bishop Conference in Drancy on September 1997. The French bishop acknowledged the church hierarchy overall silence, with the exception of the 5 protests that I mentioned, during the Holocaust, and its withdrawal into a narrow vision of the church mission. Un retrait sur une vision étroite des missions de l'Église. And I think actually Valeri is quite emblematic of this narrow conception of the church mission during that time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, I think we're going to start again. It's my pleasure to introduce the final paper, and then we will open the floor for questions for all of the papers. Massimo Faggioli is professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His most recent books are The Liminal Papacy of Pope Francis, Moving Towards Global Catholicity, published in 2020, and Joe Biden and Catholicism in the United States and Beyond, published in 2021. And we will go ahead and get started.
Thank you very much. Is it working? Yes. Thank you very much for this invitation and for organizing this conference and for keeping working on these incredibly important subjects, both for history and for theology. We heard from our esteemed colleagues in-depth historical analysis on the ways in which the Holy See and Pius XII dealt with the Holocaust during World War II in light of the newly available archival sources. As an historian and theologian who specializes in the history of church institutions and of ecclesiology, but also as a Catholic scholar coming from Italy, whose hometown is Ferrara, which I've heard before, home of the National Museum of Italian Judaism and the Shoah, my more modest contribution is to look at the theological framework in which stories unfolded in order to add the dimension of the theological drama or tragedy to those actions and failures to act, those pronouncements and silences. And in the next few minutes, I'll try to do this in two brief steps. The first step is the pre-Vatican II Catholic ecclesiology vis-à-vis anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. If we want to understand the role of the Catholic Church in the Holocaust, it is undeniable the importance of Christian theology, culture, and practices about the relationship with Judaism, theological anti-Judaism, the teaching of contempt, and the interactions between theological or religious anti-Judaism and racial anti-Semitism. But there is also a more subtle, and I think more relevant these days, ecclesiological question, that is of self-understanding of the Catholic Church in its relations with the modern state, which needs to be part, in my opinion, of the hermeneutical framework of Jewish-Christian relations. We can leave aside for now the issue of the interpretations on the modernity or the reactionary anti-modernity of the totalitarian regimes that enacted anti-Jewish policies leading to the Holocaust. What is clear is that these policies were legislated and implemented by one of the most important of the fruits of political modernity, the state or nation state. It is therefore important to look at how the Catholic Church interpreted the secular nation state, because it's with the state that, beginning with the 19th century, the Catholic Church had to interact in the slow and uneven disappearance of Christendom and of the multinational empires. On the basis of default assumptions that saw the situation of the Church in medieval Christendom, Europe, as universally normative, as the ideal, Catholic teaching had a view of the state with clear limits to its authority. It was a doctrine of the state that did not welcome the separation from the Church. The ideal was a Catholic state in which the Church had a position of high sovereignty, with the clerical authority in a position of superiority over the lay people, and with special privileges for the Catholic Church over other churches, other religions, and secular culture. This was part of a doctrine of the state expressing the official political philosophy of Catholic teaching during the so-called long 19th century, in which the hermeneutical axis revolved around the need to reject the modern post-revolution political order, liberalism, secularism, religious indifferentism, religious liberty, The goal was to reconquer the proper position for the Church against the modern concept of freedom and in favor of forging Catholic nations in the new international political order of nation-states. Catholic teaching saw the state as a providential but subordinated actor, expected though to apply a moral and religious project in which liberty and rights of the human person were treated as an artificial invention of secular modernity, perturbing the natural order. Catholic Universalism was understood in terms of forced inclusion, the interpretation of the compelle intrare from the Gospel of Luke chapter 14, in a theological political project that had little space for freedom. In the words of Joseph de Maistre, one of the Catholic theorists of a return to the Ancien Regime, or the rejection of the French Revolution, freedom is, quote, the action to be free under divine command, to be slaves freely, end quote. In this way, the Catholic Church justified theological attitudes and social policies executed by what was blessed, even though sometimes warily, as a legitimate approximation to the ideal of a Catholic state. This doctrine of the state as instrumental to keep the natural order of things and push back against modern political ideologies from liberalism to communism had consequences for all non-Catholics, and especially for the Jews, when the liberal nation-state collapsed and gave way to the totalitarian or authoritarian one-party state. This entailed not only the abrogation, at least de facto, of the liberal constitutions, but also the primacy of the party in power over the state and society. Citizenship laws that defined who was and who was not a Jew, defined by birth and by blood, widespread violence, and generalized terror. In this evolution of the totalitarian and authoritarian one-party nation-state, the Jews were the first to suffer the ethnic cleansing policies as they embodied a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, they were, as non-members of a specific national community, understood in racial ethnic terms, the most authentic representatives of the humankind, of human being, postulated by the Enlightenment. On the other hand, they were excluded from humankind whose existence was based politically on the belonging as ethnic citizens to a nation-state. In the project for a renewal of Christendom, the state had an ambivalent role. On the one hand, clear limits to its sovereignty vis-à-vis the legitimacy granted or refused to it by the Church, which was the only true interpreter of divine law and natural law. On the one hand, Jews were, in theory, the most authentic representatives of humankind postulated by the Enlightenment. But on the other hand, they were excluded from humankind whose existence was based politically on the belonging as ethnic citizens to a nation-state. In this project for a renewal of Christendom, the state had an ambivalent role. On the one hand, clear limits to its sovereignty vis-à-vis the legitimacy which was granted or refused to it by the Church, which was the only true interpreter of divine law and of natural law. And on the other hand, the state has become the unique enforcer and the most effective instrument to implement those laws. In the case of fascism and Nazism, leading to and during the Holocaust, there was, in the Catholic interpretation of modernity, an apocalyptic view of history that gave death a transcendental role, almost a mystique, and posited race as subject, biology as lexicon, with an overlap between human and animal races. A certain Catholic view of history and of the evolution of political institutions led to the acceptance, sometimes to the embrace, of this new apocalypticism expressed by Nazi and fascist, racial and racist ideologies, and made it fit with a more traditionally negative view of the Jews, that is, religious anti-Judaism. The activity of the church and church leaders to shame some Jews coexisted with the paralysis, if not often with the active collaboration with Nazi and fascist anti-Semitic policies by Catholics in the Holocaust. Paralysis and collaboration were possible not only for reasons of expediency or of survival or of alignment between social and racial ideologies, but also because of that doctrine of the state and because of an ecclesiology that did not elaborate on the duty to speak to power on behalf also of the Jews and to speak to the state. So there was indeed a wartime Catholic critique of racial anti-Semitism, faulted to departing from the traditional and Catholic anti-Judaism. But it was a critique of racial anti-Semitism that still insisted on the need of the eventual conversion of the Jews. The only possible solution to the so-called Jewish question was the eventual incorporation of the Jewish people into the mystical body of Christ. This was one of the effects of the theological supersessionism within Catholic culture. Most Catholics held that since the Jews had rejected Jesus, the religion was invalid and had been superseded. So there were areas of overlap between theological anti-Judaism and racial anti-Semitism, which gave legitimacy in the eyes of many Catholics to a nation-state that they had looked at warily since its rise in the modern political order. If the official Catholic discourse on the Jews kept some distance from biological racism, at the same time, it had to be blind to the policies against the Jews because no matter how socially and culturally integrated, they were ultimately seen as impossible to assimilate and hostile to the Christian nations. This theological and political overlap between traditional theological anti-Judaism and the totalitarian and authoritarian one-party nation-state resulted in the ultimate catastrophe, also from a theological point of view, with World War II and the Holocaust. This was also an ecclesiological catastrophe because the ideology of the Societas Perfecta needed a state. And it is interesting to note that during World War II and in the immediate post-World II period, before Vatican II, the Catholic Church's earliest awareness of its tragic error was expressed not clearly in terms of the rejection of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, but early on in terms of reconsideration of its doctrine on political modernity and especially on democracy. Pius XII, 12 cautious and implicit gestures towards the problem of democracy in his Christmas radio messages of 1942 and 44 were not just a pragmatic realization of the trajectory of the conflict between the Allies and the Nazi and fascist regimes, but also the beginning of the correction to the reactionary apocalyptic political theology expressed, among others, by Carl Schmitt. And it was at the beginning of an ecclesiological turn that started with the encyclical of 1943, Mystici Corporis. Second part, the Holocaust and the signs of the times at the Second Vatican Council for ecclesiology. The theology of the relations between church and state, which had given acceptance, and not always for pragmatism, to the Nazi and fascist ideology, included a race-based concept of citizenship. This found a definitive turn only at the Second Vatican Council. And it's not a coincidence, rather evidence, that at Vatican II, the debates of the schema on religious liberty, which became the Unitatis Humanae, and the schema on the Jews, which later became Nostra Aetate, followed parallel paths. Nostra Aetate made enormous steps forward with clear limits and blind spots towards a new understanding of the Jews and of Judaism by the Catholic Church, and in making clear the incompatibility of anti-Semitism with Catholic doctrine. Nostra Aetate was an indirect but unmistakable acknowledgement of the Shoah and of responsibilities of anti-Jewish theology and of the Catholic Church in the history of anti-Semitism. It was also the beginning of the end to hoping for the conversion of the Jews to Christianity. But the conversion of Vatican II on this was expressed not just in Nostra Aetate. One of the most important thinkers at the Second Vatican Council, French Dominican Yves Congar, wrote in his journal of Vatican II, the day May 3rd, 1965, quote, 20 years after Auschwitz, the Council cannot fail to speak of the Jews, end quote. In the views of many of those who saw church reform in terms of ressourcement, with the great theological tradition of the sources, going back to the true sources to get rid of anti-Semitism and of anti-Judaism, in order to engage theological reform, the issue of ecclesiology was an internal and domestic one, but not for all of them. At Vatican II, Yves Congar addressed the Holocaust through a different theological category, that of the signs of the times. Congar saw, even before Nostra Aetate of 1965, John the 23rd, last encyclical Pacem in Terris of April 11th, 1963, opened a new page in ecclesiology, but also for the ecclesiology of the Jewish-Catholic relations, because it opened a path to a new understanding of the relations between the Church and the modern world, and also with the Jews. The Holocaust is indeed a key moment in the history of the development of Catholic ecclesiology, as it pushed the Church to reconsider also its doctrine of the state and its relations with the modern political dispensation. The last document approved by Vatican II in 1965, Gaudium et Spes, was a break with the doctrine of the direct subordination of the temporal order to the supernatural order, and of the Church affirmed the distinction between civil and political communities, emphasized the need of a political community for the common good, made clear the difference between church and political community. In other words, it is far more than what has been dismissively described as just a position to accommodate for the collapse of nation states that identified themselves as Catholic. It was much more than that. And the first step taken by Catholic teaching in the intermediate steps between Pius XII and Vatican II was a slow, cautious reassessment of the role of the state as limited by something that precedes the state. That was not entirely new. What was new, in my opinion, was the emphasis on the dignity of every human person as the member of the one human family. What is important to note here is that the major theological turn of Nostra Aetate and the recognition of the Jewishness of Jesus was a rejection of anti-Semitism and admittedly only indirectly of anti-Judaism, but this also required a new ecclesiology of the relations between church and state. In conclusion, Vatican II made a key step from the early reckonings of the Holocaust and World War II in ecclesiological terms that had a huge impact on the understanding of the Second World War and of the Holocaust. Quite new was the revision at Vatican II of the role of the Church. Not just the state is limited, but also the Church is limited. Limited not by the state or by public order, but also, first of all, self-limited. A church whose ecclesiology is self-limited by the gospel. Internally, it's limited by God's self-revelation in scriptures and in the gospel. Externally, limited also by the recognition of the role of society, which includes non-Catholic members, a view of society not just as a limit to the power of the state, which was also there before Vatican II, but also of the Church. This amounted to abandoning the idea of the Church as a counter-society, a community at prayer, a tribunal, a guild, a socioeconomic system separated from and opposed to a multicultural and multi-religious society. In other words, after 1945, being put on the stand of something like a theological tribunal after the tragic history of an ecclesiastical ideology that persisted until World War II and the Holocaust, the reform movements within Catholicism rediscovered, in light of the gospel, the humanistic virtues of the respect of all human beings as such, of their rights, safety, and dignity. And this entailed a rethinking of ecclesiology, of the church in the modern world, and of the relationship between church, society, and state. Vatican II did it in ways that were significantly, in my opinion, different from, and a development of, the Catholic critiques of racial anti-Semitism of the 1930s and during World War II. Thank you very much.